for the glasses, they are here to cover up the fact that I am reading off of a script, and also the fact that I almost never make direct eye contact with the camera. Trust me, it's better this way. My choice for this project is the manga Reiraku, or Downfall by Inio Asano. I chose it because it is complicated and not often talked about, despite Inio Asano being a beloved contemporary author, and I've always just wanted an excuse to talk about it deeply, so here we go. Let's start with Bazin. His theory is really fixated with this psychological need in people that he dubs the mummy complex, an idea that aims to defy death by having something act as a representation of your life after worldly departure. With the advent of photography, Bazin notes that art had previously sought to replicate reality in an attempt to fulfill a similar psychological need for the controlling of time. By duplicating the world outside oneself through art, you could be thought to have mastered it, and by extension mastered death itself. But with photography and cinema, Bazin believes that now the duration of an image can be captured, or in his words, change mummified. Not just are we replicating the outside world, but we are recording it through the near automatic process of pressing a single button. The shadow of an author's hand is now far less significant than it was with painting or other such art forms. So what of manga? It exists as a post-photographic art form, yet here in Downfall we see something interesting. Photographs of real-life locations are used as backgrounds to give the world a sense of verisimilitude, and these photos are edited on a computer, oftentimes with CGI and texture gradients. At a glance, this seems to fit well with Bazin's theory of plastic realism, in that it aims to replicate reality as closely as possible, but Downfall actually subverts this idea through caricature. In a manga about manga, Asano attempts to call attention to the irony of this story, that one's obsessions with the literary can affect so deeply their relationships and worldview that the real becomes surreal by nature. Unrealistic designs are drawn with anatomical correctness and shaded intricately with smears and toners to give them a believability, despite the fact that it clashes with the manga's otherwise accurate representation of the world. Everyone here is a character, whether they know it or not. Furthermore, time in comics is dependent on spatial relationships. This isn't simply a matter of juxtaposition like you would find in Eisenstein. Rather, the very size of a panel can connote different measurements of time. So for example, a small panel might read like an insert shot would in a film, whereas a large panel could span an unspecified amount of time. The real estate of the page is what drives the pacing of manga in this sense. Returning to Downfall, you might notice it's quite vertically oriented, to the point that the top of the book has this really satisfying look to it. You can literally see where like every panel begins at the very top. They're all in the exact same spot, nearly every single page. It's just unnatural. This means that most panels in Downfall are quite large, so the story jumps more often from subject to subject rather than from action to action. As such, there's this frequent contradiction at play, where the realism of the setting has us believe that the world is in constant motion, i.e., it moves independent of our protagonist. Yet it's also completely static, which harkens back to Bazin's notion of cinema as objectivity in time. Manga could be thought to function in the same way, but I think there's an interesting implication here that suggests time is itself a relational variable, and that its duration is subject to the spatial properties of an image rather than simply existing independent of the photograph. That's enough about Bazin for now. Let's move on to Freud. I misplaced my glasses, so I will now speak through the medium of this sick Sailor Mercury snow globe. I mean, like, it's not as cool as like a Sailor Mars snow globe, but you know, like, beggars can't be choosers. Freud believed that all people metaphorically experience a moment of trauma where they realize they should fear something that could potentially happen to them. To cope with this fear, Freud says that we use objects or people as substitutes for the innocence we once had prior to developing this fear. These substitutes thereby become fetishes, in his terms. The very first line in Downfall references the protagonist Kaoru's fetish object, that being eyes like that of a cat. According to him, he becomes anxious around women with cat-like eyes because he once dated one in college. He says this despite the avant title obscuring the woman's face completely, thus characterizing her less as a tangible person and more like an agent by which he projects his desires onto. His inability to understand her and the reasons she left him have thus caused him to subconsciously seek out women who he deems indecipherable,
because only they can bring out the curiosity he once had about the world. While this is predominantly a section about Freud, I want to touch briefly on Lacan here, as one thing that Kaoru lacks throughout Downfall is a stable sense of self, something he once tried to rectify through the medium of manga. Returning to our opening monologue, our very first introduction of Kaoru is a thin, horizontal panel with him tucked distantly off-center, revealing his startling lack of presence within his own memories, and foreshadowing his mounting narcissism as he tries desperately to regain agency within a story that is both tied completely to him, but is absolutely indifferent to his well-being. And this brings us to Mulvey, who rightfully points out the inherent contradictions found in Freud and, by extension, Kaoru. In her words, the paradox of phallocentrism in all of its manifestations is that it depends on the image of the castrated woman to give order and meaning to its world. Women, in Freudian terms, only serve as the means by which men may act out their desires and create meanings based on the symbolic order their lack of a penis signifies, despite the fact that they themselves get no role in creating their own meanings within this patriarchal paradigm. As such, Mulvey believes that film can reduce people to mere objects for the viewer to then control under the gaze of a male-dominated society. So let's apply this to Downfall. Kaoru is an extremely interesting character in just how awful of a human being he is. He desires women because he craves unconditional devotion, and yet he also treats the one person he wants attention from the most, his wife, terribly, going so far as to blame her for all of his failings, divorcing her, abusing her, basically every scummy thing you could possibly imagine. The manga points out myriad times his perverted gaze, and his role as a manga author speaks volumes to his scopophilia. Once again, let's return to our opening monologue. The presence of narration implies that Kaoru's misogynistic worldview has absolute command over everything we as readers understand about the story. But this is undermined when his ex-girlfriend quite literally responds to the narration, saying that she is not at all like what he says she is, and that his lack of empathy is more failing on his part than it is her simply being esoteric. Of course, Kaoru doesn't actually think about what she's criticizing him for, that being his egotism and self-absorption, and he even seems apathetic to her departure. So, yeah, he kind of learned nothing from his mistakes, and going forward, his lack of self-awareness ends up being the quote-unquote downfall that the manga's title pays reference to.
So let's recap, and yes, I did get new glasses. Thank you for noticing. With Bazin, we found that the nature of time and realism in Downfall is relative to spatial variables, and so extends his theories on the potentials of photography. With Freud, we've seen how a character driven by his ego confronts the contradictions of fetishism, fear, and identity in the wake of a midlife crisis. And finally, with Mulvey, we have an attempt at criticism towards the phallocentric model of mainstream fiction that takes aim at Downfall's very own medium of message, manga. Granted, it still has some objectifying qualities to it. It does want people to look as beautiful as possible in this romantic sense, but it's the start. What we've seen is that Downfall is a manga rife with potential when it comes to theory, and its nature as manga that imitates cinematic qualities allows us to explore further some theories such as Bazin's. If anything, I found that there's much more that could be said about it had time permitted it, and other theories not covered here like Eisenstein, Lacan, and especially Adorno could be applied here. The story is so dense and the techniques used so opaque that we could read into it in innumerable ways, which is why it's such a gem worth examining. Hopefully this video will convince people to further study Downfall, because God Inio Sano knows, I sure will. Thank you.